My name is Eileen McLarnon. I would like to introduce you to Joe Zapytowski, a 91-year-old United States Army veteran of World War II. Joe served 35 months in both Europe and the Pacific. Joe, it's very nice to see you this morning. If you'd like to tell us about your life and your history of being in World War II.
It'd be my pleasure. It's good to be here with you.
Thank you.
My name is Joseph S. Zapytowski. I was born on July 21st, 1924, in a house on Gandy Street in Detroit, Michigan. My parents came to this country in 1907 and in 1914. My dad came here in 07 and my mother in 1914. They both came here from that part of old Poland around Lvov that was then a part of Austria and currently is a part of Ukraine. While still in high school, I made recordings for broadcast over Radio Free Europe in the Polish language. The hope was that these broadcasts would somehow give hope and encouragement to Poles living under Hitler and Stalin. While still in high school, as a newsboy, I hawked an extra edition of the Detroit News the early morning of September 1st, 1939, announcing Hitler's invasion of Poland. I did so along Mitchell and Joseph Campos streets to all who could hear me. And they could hear me, because that was pretty loud. After graduating from Northeastern High School in Detroit in June of 1942, my friends Mitchell Kalasa, Norbert Koss, and I made the rounds of Navy and Air Force recruiting stations. Recruiters seemed not particularly interested in us. We even went to the Merchant Marine recruiting station, but that day there were some pretty tough-looking guys there, and we just didn't stay there any longer. Took off. I enrolled that fall at Wayne State University, taking morning classes in history and physics. From 3:30 until midnight, I worked the afternoon shift at Cadillac Motors building tanks. My job was to inspect camshafts for Allison engines to very exacting tolerances. My number was called by my draft board in the spring of 1943, and I was inducted into the U.S. Army on May 10th, 1943 at Fort Custer near Battle Creek, Michigan. As a result, I lost credits for the second semester at Wayne State University. A small group of us were shipped to Camp Crowder near Neosho, Missouri for basic training. Memories of Camp Crowder was that it was hot, dusty, and not near anything exciting. The small town of Neosho was the leave town, and it catered to Army personnel with all manner of enticements, for a price, of course. Basic training was just that. A lot of marches, rifle training, crawling under wire with live ordnance explosions, which cost me my right eardrum. The weapon assigned to us was the heavy Enfield 1903 rifle. Another notable experience was an operation performed on me in a field hospital set up to give doctors and medics training under combat conditions. Recovery was no fun. Thanks to the primitive conditions such as slit trenches that accommodated the normal processing of the intestines and bladder. Clerk school was next on the U.S. Army's to-do list for me. That's where I learned to type. Interestingly enough, that stood me in good stead in my first teaching job after the war, where in a small high school, as a high school principal, that was one of the subjects that I taught. That happened in a very small high school of about 100 kids. Somewhere along the way, I became a private first class. That's not a very exciting moment. Late in the summer of '43, I was transferred to the Army Specialized Training Program with stops in Denver, Colorado for about a half a day, and then for a couple of weeks at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. One of the highlights for me was my one and only experience on horseback. on the wide Wyoming prairie. I was assigned to the University of Missouri in Columbia for the fall semester, where I studied chemistry, physics, math, among other freshman courses. Sometime in March of 1944, I began experiencing medical issues, and late in March I was transferred to the Army Hospital at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. I spent 3 months there and was in the hospital on D-Day. It turned out that I developed angioedema, though it took the doctors a long time to diagnose the problem. For a while, I was thought to have elephantiasis, where the treatment I underwent was to have blood taken from my arm and injected into my butt. As I remember it, the needle was very long. I'm sure that other treatments were tried, but that one really stood out. I was released from the Fort Leonard Wood Hospital sometime in June after D-Day. Once again, it was Camp Crowder for me, this time to be assigned to the 547th Signal Base Depot Company. Soon afterward, I was promoted to the rank of T5, a technical corporal. During my stay there that summer, I often hitchhiked to towns in Oklahoma. Miami had a very active USO, and that held some attraction for me. My reach into Oklahoma extended to Claremore, the home of Will Rogers, where I took flying lessons in a Piper J3 Cub. That was a really great way to escape the routine of the Army. I flew into the Tulsa airport several times for landing and takeoff drills with my instructor. I loved the drills, where I deliberately stalled the plane, resulting in thrilling tailspins toward Earth and then recovery. By September, we found ourselves stationed at Camp Edison in Seagirt, New Jersey, on the beach. We were housed in 6 or 8 man tents on wood platforms with a stove in the center. I tell you, it was pretty cold by morning. On a number of occasions, on awakening, I'd have to shake off a couple of inches of snow that had infiltrated the tent onto my blanket. The 547 trained in nearby Avon at the Signal Corps warehouse in a miniature depot. We were getting ready to set up a depot somewhere overseas where we would receive and ship signal equipment to units in the field. It was a 4-hour trip to Philadelphia, where I had aunts, uncles, and cousins, and I did make the trip a few times on weekend passes. Those were great diversions. I recall a training flight in a J3 Cub out of a small airport outside of Philadelphia. The airport was on a hill, so you took off downhill and landed uphill. By the way, I never soloed, just plain ran out of time. Late in November of 1944, we were transferred to the Fort Holabird Army Signal Depot in Baltimore, Maryland. There we received hands-on training in a large working signal depot for several weeks. One of my cousins and her husband lived in Baltimore, and they were really very good to me during my stay there. The 547 returned to Camp Edison for additional field training during the winter of '44, and we ended our stay there on January 30th with the transfer of our company to Camp Kilmer in preparation for deployment overseas. We left Camp Kilmer on February 7th, 1945. I had quite an adventure on the 6th. I left camp without a pass that evening to visit family and friends in Philadelphia. I figured it could well be my last opportunity to do so, and as it turned out, it could very well have been really consequential for me. The trip by bus to Philly took almost a couple of hours, and I got back to Camp Kilmer around 4 in the morning. After sneaking through a hole in the camp's fence, I hiked back to my barracks, only to find everyone up, almost fully packed, ready for the anticipated trip overseas. You can imagine that I was pretty speedy in packing my belongings into a duffel bag and getting into formation in front of our barracks with the rest of the guys in the 547th. That was my one and only serious transgression. Our company was transported to a pier in Jersey City, where we boarded the ferry Red Bank, which took us up the river to a pier in Manhattan. There we boarded the USS Mount Vernon, a large luxury liner, formerly called the SS Washington. Interestingly, my dad lived in Hoboken, just northeast of Jersey City, for a couple of years after coming to the U.S. The crossing was uneventful, even though we sailed without escort. The Mount Vernon was a fast ship that sailed a zigzag course. We slept and lounged stacked 4 high on canvas bunks. I was lucky enough to have a porthole view from my bunk. The sea rushing by almost made my trip a first-class event. At night, we were totally blacked out, with eerie red lighting allowing for movement when necessary. The Mount Vernon docked in Liverpool, England on the 16th, and we boarded a train which took us to Andover, where we transferred to trucks for the trip to Barton Stacey Hans. There we were lined up for inspection by our company commander, Captain Welch. I recall the event vividly. It was raining hard, it was really cold, and on top of that, all of us were hoping to get into a sack. We could hardly wait to be dismissed so we could just flop down. I was so cold that I shivered in my bed in full clothing under blankets until reveille, when a breakfast of hot coffee and bangers finally gave me a bit of warmth. The 547 remained at Barton Stacey for a couple of weeks. During that time, I got to London a couple of times. This gave me an opportunity to see many of the legendary sights of the city and experience what Londoners had lived with for many months. Buzz bombs, as they were called by Londoners, often interrupted sleep with their jet noise and then silence, followed by an explosion, close and very loud, or distant and somewhat muted. A couple of highlights of these visits included the Tower of London and the taking of tea and crumpets in a restaurant dated to the 16th century, with doorways so low that I had to stoop in order to get through. On March 3rd, we were trucked to Southampton, where we boarded the Liberty ship USS Marine Wolf for a night crossing of the English Channel. For some reason, I was among the very last to board and therefore unable to find a free berth. As I searched for a place to sleep, I found the ship's brig and the bow of the ship to be empty. There were bars on the door, making it look very much like the prison cell that it was. I was joined by several Italian prisoners of war who must have had the same problem. They were parolees. German subs still prowled the channel, and the channel itself was mined. However, the Marine Wolf crossed without incident. We entrained and traveled to Paris, where we spent several hours waiting for transport to Belgium. An incident in the men's room of the railway station gave me pause as I witnessed a woman with a small boy in hand come into the room as I was relieving myself. We boarded 40 and 8s of World War I vintage for our trip to Courcelles. Needless to say, that was pretty much a stand-up trip. The 547th was quartered in an elementary school just a short distance from the signal depot we were to operate in an abandoned Pittsburgh plate glass factory. That building, we surmised, must have been used by the Germans to repair planes and or store parts for the German Luftwaffe. We found several remnants of planes on the property. The 547th supplied signal equipment to many Army groups, notably the 3rd Army under General Patton, as well as some units of the Army Air Force. The signal depot we ran was among the largest in the Army. I often visited Charleroi, a nearby larger city, and the Water 2 battleground near Brussels and that city itself. I had somewhat of a passion for history, so these were fertile grounds for exploration, as were a number of other nearby Belgian and French cities. The trips to Brussels were by electric street rail car and took about an hour. I recall lowering our flag to half-mast with my Staff Sergeant Livesey on the occasion of President Roosevelt's death on April 12th. About a month later, on May 8th, it was VE Day, and celebrations abounded in towns large and small, and we raised the American flag then to full mast. The men of the 547th were awarded a battle star. While we may have been in some danger at times, we were never in a battle. However, our warrant officer was our liaison officer with Patton's Third Army, and he spent many days with them relative to the delivery and operation of signal equipment, and thus he and the rest of the 547 received a battle star. During our time in Courcelles, we did suffer one casualty. One of ours got a hold of some bad liquor and died as a result. While I have forgotten his name, I can see his face when I recall the incident. A little over a month later, on June 13th, 1945, we again boarded 40 and 8s, heading for the old Roman town of Arles near the port of Marseille. The 547 was billeted in tents without particular duties assigned to us, so we were free to explore the area, often with day passes. Arles, with its Colosseum and aqueducts, proved most interesting, as did Marseille. On July 31st, we boarded trucks for the trip to Marseille, our port of departure from France. The men of the 547 boarded the Liberty ship USS Seaflyer. She was a far cry from the Mount Vernon, or Atlantic, crossing ship. The Seaflyer was much smaller and a very, very crowded ship. Many of us spent most of our time above decks both day and night. I enjoyed sleeping on deck in spite of being awakened very early each morning by sailors swabbing the deck. We were in the Atlantic when we first began to hear reports of the devastating atomic bombings, first of Hiroshima and then of Nagasaki. The Seaflyer docked in the Panama Canal zone on August 11th, and we were allowed off the ship to take a shower ashore. The passage through the canal was very interesting. 3 or 4 days later, we heard that the Emperor of Japan had surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. By then, we were in the Pacific, and every man aboard thought the ship would be turned northward toward California. No such luck. We did not get to go home. The ship continued to proceed westward toward the Far East. The Seaflyer made a stop in New Guinea, then for refueling. As we crossed the equator on our way to New Guinea, we were subjected to the naval tradition of being transformed from polywogs to shellbacks, and then inducted into the kingdom of Neptune. This was done by dousing repeatedly, by being doused repeatedly with buckets of seawater at the hands of gleeful sailor shellbacks, some carrying Neptune's tridents. After about a month and a half aboard ship, we arrived in Manila Bay and were barged to shore, where we confronted the devastation that was Manila. The 547th was transported to a huge city of tents in Quezon City, just outside of Manila, where we were assigned quarters. There we waited for further orders and had many opportunities to explore the city and beaches. A memorable experience for me was the visit to Corregidor by way of an Army Signal Corps tug. To be on that island and in its tunnels was very emotional for me. So many had died and suffered there. Though the war was over, that was not the case for many Japanese who kept holding out in the forests and caves around Manila. Late in November, I was assigned to run a film exchange unit in Seoul, Korea. It was deemed a priority move to be fulfilled by air transport. I waited about 6 weeks for that priority transport. Finally, on December 23rd, I boarded a C-47 along with other GIs and several Army nurses. The plane landed in Okinawa to refuel before proceeding to Kyoto, Japan, where we spent the night. After over 2,100 miles in the air, we arrived in Seoul, where I was transported to a small building near downtown Seoul that was to serve as headquarters for the operation and my billet, which I shared with another GI whose name, for the life of me, I cannot recall. I attended Christmas Eve midnight Mass in the Catholic Cathedral in Seoul the very day I arrived in Korea. Among the memories I have of that assignment were the ever-constant honey wagons transporting human waste for fertilization of farmlands. Another was the stone bathtub in a shed outside our quarters. The tub was shaped like a half an egg, which had to be filled with buckets of water and then heated by a wood fire under the tub. Needless to say, baths were few and far between. Even then, Seoul was part of South Korea, occupied by the Americans, while the Russians, who had recently declared war against Japan, occupied the north. The Soviets landed in the north on August 14th, 1945, the very day Japan surrendered to the Allies. About 3 weeks later, on September 8th, the Americans occupied Korea south of the 38th parallel, a prearranged temporary dividing line between the two Koreas. That dividing line exists to this day. The job of the film exchange was to provide movies to Army and Air Corps units in South Korea. It didn't become the Air Force till after World War II. As one of the most important forms of entertainment, these movies were in high demand. On a number of occasions, I drove to Incheon Harbor, where the tide was 30 feet, to trade films that I had for films available aboard Navy and merchant ships. Some ships were docked while others were at anchor in the harbor. Boarding ships at anchor was often difficult, especially in choppy harbor seas, with my heavy load of films to trade. Often the films aboard ship were of more recent release than films I had in my inventory. Early in March of 1946, I accumulated the requisite number of points to qualify for transfer home and discharge from the Army Signal Corps. Again, it was another Liberty ship that took me home via Seattle and Fort Lewis in Washington State. No sleeping on deck this time, as the weather was chilly to cold. Instead, I spent a lot of time reading novels and researching colleges I might attend once I got back to my home in Detroit. I spent many a night reading in the restroom. That was the only place where there was light enough to read by. It was there aboard ship that I determined to attend Central Michigan College of Education in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, to fulfill my goal of becoming a teacher. My brother John was a couple of years younger than I. John, who died last November, served in the U.S. Navy. His sea duty was aboard a Navy PCE. Interestingly, as a soldier, I had more sea time than my sailor brother. The few days I spent at Fort Lewis resulted in painful shin splints. There was nowhere in Fort Lewis that one could walk to or from without walking either up or downhill. After a few days, I was bound for Camp McCoy in Madison, Wisconsin. There, on April 10th, 1946, 35 months to the day from my induction into the Army at Camp Custer, I was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army with the pay I was due and a train ticket for Detroit. Eager to get on with my education, I enrolled that June at Central Michigan College of Education for the summer session. It was there in the fall at CMCE that the most extraordinary thing happened to me during the first Friday night dance on September 6, 1946. Cal Byers, who lost an arm in Germany, and I spotted a couple of girls dancing together. As it turned out, they were close friends from Reed City High School and freshmen at CMCE. We cut in on Katie Baker and Jean Dickerson, and I got Jean, and we've been dancing ever since. We were married on June 10th, 1950. Jean got her BS at 10 in the morning, and we were married at 2 in the afternoon. She was able to support me by then. By the way, Jean and Katie were airplane spotters in Reed City during the war. I was among millions of GIs who benefited from the GI Bill. I received my BA degree in education, summa cum laude, from CMCE in 1949, my MA in history from the University of Michigan in 1950, with an additional year toward a PhD in Eastern European history. My studies terminated in the summer of 1951. Stephen, our firstborn, joined us earlier in June, and I had to get a job to support our family. I accepted a position in Leroy, Michigan, where, among other things, I taught typing, which I learned in the Army at Camp Crowder. Over the next 10 years, Stephen was joined by Carrie Jo, Mark, and Joe Jr. Unfortunately, we lost Carrie Jo to complications from juvenile diabetes in 1997. In 1964, I earned my PhD in educational administration, in large part thanks to my wife Jean, who taught kindergarten that year to provide for our family of 6, plus a dog and a cat. Thanks also to scholarships from the American Association of School Administrators and the University of Michigan. I retired from public education after 3 years as a teacher and principal of that very small high school, and then after 36 years as superintendent of schools in 5 communities in Michigan and Connecticut. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for your very interesting presentation of this, of the very important years of your life during World War II.
Thank you.
We appreciate your being with us here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.